A decision has been reached over whether Winnipeg police officers were justified in the fatal shooting of a Nigerian international student in Winnipeg. 19-year-old Afolabi Stephen Opaso was shot dead by officers who were responding to a well-being call. This was New Year's Eve, December 31st, 2023. Police say when they arrived on scene, Opaso was armed with 2 knives. In January 2024, the Independent Investigation Unit of Manitoba turned the investigation over to the Alberta Serious Incident Response Team. The Alberta Police Watchdog was the one that released its decision yesterday. In the decision, multiple witnesses say Opaso was experiencing what appeared to be a mental health crisis. His roommates called police who arrived a short time later. The witness officer said Opaso ran at another officer while holding 2 knives. That officer fatally shot him 3 times. The officer who killed Opaso exercised their right to not be interviewed or share their notes during the investigation. The acting executive director of Alberta's police watchdog concluded, quote, "There are no reasonable grounds to believe that the subject officer committed an offence," unquote. Cash Heat is former chief of the West Vancouver Police Department and former Solicitor General in British Columbia. He's familiar with this case, and he is with us to talk about this from a bigger picture point of view. Good morning.
Good morning.
So what stood out for you, details about the report regarding police behavior on the scene?
Well, let's look at what they had to deal with. They had to deal with how police are trained and have to respond to these types of incidents. And I think that at the end of the day, the officer was protecting themselves from grievous bodily injury or death as a result of their action. So when you take that into account and the fact that they're trained to respond to people that are armed in these circumstances, you can understand why they reached the conclusion. Where I'm coming from on this is initially when the information came in that this individual was dealing with a crisis because of his mental condition, whether that type of response was required immediately at that point. Were people in danger? Was the individual going to harm himself or whatever? And I think that's what we have to look at in responding to it. So I'm not going to criticize the police officers with respect to this. What I do want to criticize is how we develop policy and training to respond to these crises, because the crises are increasing. This scenario has been played out several times over the last couple of decades here in Canada, and it continues to be played out. We continue to be responding based on our default training and policies. We need to change that aspect of it.
Now, while I appreciate that you want to focus on the response, I do want to ask you a couple of things that we learned out of the report, if I may. I said in the introduction, the officer who killed Opaso declined to be interviewed by investigators or provide notes, as is his right. What would you say to someone who thinks that that's one of a change that should be made, that subject officers should be compelled to be interviewed?
Well, absolutely, they should be. We've gone through that here in British Columbia, where, in fact, the officers that were involved in a fatality did not want to even be interviewed or provide their duty notes as required. I have a different opinion on that. I give them the fact that they're public service people. They should be required to provide their duty notes with respect to this, and if they want to be interviewed, they can be interviewed. But this refusal to cooperate with the investigators is not the approach that I find is appropriate given our police services that are operating across the country.
Why would an officer not want to be interviewed?
Well, there's various things. They are entitled, and they do get legal counsel right at the outset, and usually legal counsel will advise them and not to at that, based on my experience in dealing with these types of situations where police officers are involved in. And the other part of it, even if the ones that do cooperate, usually their statement is well scrutinized by their legal counsel before it's even forwarded to the investigators with respect to what has occurred here.
One of the other details I wanted to ask you about is the witness officer who did speak to the investigators told investigators that she tried to draw her taser, but then Opaso, made a run at her partner, and then the shots were fired. Who shot him, rather, to be clear, not the witness officer shooting. How important is that of a detail to what happened? Trying to get the taser, and when you think about response.
Well, it's a very dynamic situation, and I've been involved in these dynamic situations where an individual all of a sudden responds in a fashion where you have to escalate the use of force. And in her mind, based on what you've told me, she was looking for a less lethal option with respect to that, and that's how they're trained. It's a progression of force. But again, putting themselves in the situation where they had to utilize lethal force is the problem to begin with at the outset. Now, as I say, it's very dynamic, and the officers are certainly want to go home at the end of their shift, and they have a right to. And that's why we got to the point that we did, and that's why we got to the point where ACERT has said the use of force was reasonable given the circumstances on that. But again, if we don't change the policy with respect to this, or look at other ways to respond to these, and having this at the pinnacle of the response, fine. But you don't want to go to that high escalation at the outset if there is an opportunity to deal with this in a different fashion.
How do you identify if there is an opportunity to deal with this in a different fashion before you're on scene? What facts do you look for, or circumstances do you lean into that would dictate a different response?
Well, there's a couple things. There seems to be, in this particular case, from what I've read, there was a considerable amount of information coming in from the roommates with regard to this individual's behavior at the time, and the fact that he was armed at that particular time. So you have an opportunity while you're responding to this to gather that information. I think part of that information that would be obtained, I would hope, is whether individuals are in immediate danger as a result of this individual, or is he, for example, in a room by himself with these particular knives. So your approach to the situation may be different at that point. Now, if in fact he was holding a knife to someone's throat or something like that, or had the ability to harm someone immediately because of his behavior, you can understand you would go to a higher level of force immediately and get the officers in. But again, there may be an opportunity. I don't want to second guess in the minds of the officers at the time, but there may have been an opportunity to look at this in a bit of a different fashion. However, if you don't train your officers to be aware of that, if you don't change the policies with respect to that, we're going to continue to have these unfortunate and tragic incidents. And it's not going to only affect the family of the individual that lost his life. This will sit with the police officers for the rest of their lives also.
There were, you talked about the calls that led up to the police, arriving on scene. We also learn in the report, or hear in the report, that officers entered the apartment with their guns drawn. What do you make of that detail?
Well, again, they're trained to respond like that. And this is part of the problem. Like, not everyone's going to agree with my approach here. I don't think we should go to that high level if there's an opportunity to do something else. Like, I woke up this morning to racist and hate emails as a result of the story that was played out in the media. But I've been through this before, because there's a certain culture within policing and within society that want us to take that aggressive approach right at the outset, and especially when we're dealing with minority people. So this is a problem with society right now, and there is a problem with our policymakers with respect to dealing with this. We seem to be having this political approach to how we want to deal with these situations versus realistically what should be done to ensure that the officers go home safe at the end of their shift, and that we're saving people's lives, not taking people's lives.
Racist and hate emails because your position on this is that there should be changes to how responses happen?
Absolutely, and this is not the first time this has happened, and it kind of motivates me to be more an advocate for change in policing because of this. So, again, I have been steadfast in my position on how we reform policing across Canada, and some of the reasons why we need to reform it, because the 1970s way of the professional model of policing with the level of force is not acceptable now, especially when we're dealing with a different era and how people are reacting, and the fact that we have so many people that are experiencing mental health crisis out there right now.
What's the way forward for the Winnipeg Police Service should they be pursuing? And, the new chief has talked, at great length about trying to pursue, community relationships and also trying to look at the issues that would rebuild trust between the population and with the community. So when responding to something like this, for example, a well-being call, which is initially what it was, and then more detail, of course, and knives involved. But where does the service go from here? You said training a couple of times, but training in what, and who else should be responding to support that training?
Well, I think we have to broaden how we approach this and broaden how we train our police officers because of the crisis that they're dealing with at the time. I think we have to take more approaches to de-escalation of these and possibly have other people respond with us when we're dealing with this. I'm not saying we have a completely social response to it. There is a role for the police to play in these particular incidents, but there's a role for others to play. For example, mental health workers that we have with riding around with police officers. We've had very successful interventions as a result of that here in British Columbia and especially in the Vancouver area over the years. And I think we have to broaden that approach to bring in other people to deal with it. The police are the default service, but they're not the ultimate service in dealing with it. And we have a problem right now with trying to change our police services. So the chief has an opportunity to change the service, because if he does not change it, I'm not sure our politicians have the wherewithal to actually change it too. So it's got to be driven by these police leaders to make those appropriate changes to gain the credibility within their communities that they serve each and every day. And I think our police officers will benefit because of that style of leadership.
Just as a last question, there were two other roommates in the apartment. They were in one of the bedrooms when, Opaso was in there and police responded. You had highlighted in the middle of our interview that had he been in there alone, you might view this differently.
Yes, absolutely. If they're in a segregated part, and again, it's I'm not going to second guess these officers, but the appropriate response from my expertise is if they were in a separate room, if we could remove them from the suite, you have an opportunity with Mr. Opaso just there by himself to start to negotiate and start to work with him, bring in the other people.
I thought you meant had the other people been out of the apartment, but even you're saying if they were segregated in a bedroom, as the report says they were, that to you is also an opportunity to work with the person outside by themselves.
Absolutely. There's several opportunities that can be garnished from this in hindsight. But again, we've got to make sure that initially we have these practices in place so we can deal with it, whether it's removing the two individuals from the apartment, so Mr. Opaso is in the apartment alone, or even segregated in a separate room.
Kashid, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Kashid, former chief of the West Vancouver Police Department, former Solicitor General in British Columbia.